there's times, and like when I first started playing with Rivers, he wasn't used to playing with bass players that played that far behind. So he was constantly like, dude, that downbeat, that downbeat, that downbeat, you know, like almost like sitting with a pad going, what are you doing with all these downbeats in the song, you know? And so I would kept saying, like, he's like, man, it just makes that fucking pocket bigger. And to me, it makes it sound heavier. And there are times, like when you're dropping in on a chorus, that you can't really be that far behind.
Right.
You know what I mean? It just doesn't work all the time. Like in a James Brown world, there's a way to still capture that heaviness, but still nail the one. You know, so I'm always learning that. Like there's always something to study in that point. It's like the downbeat of the choruses better be on the money, killing. You know what I mean? So is there a way that I can do that and still still have
tension,
you know,
right?
Or play on top without rushing, you know? It's,
right, that's the opposite.
That's
issue.
the opposite.
Right. Where you're
play on top without rushing.
Or sometimes play behind in a verse to build up something,
Yeah.
and then when it really goes over, you know, over the top, then you play ahead.
So I got good practice with this with Mark. Then I went to MI and I met a teacher, a piano player named Kat, and Taka was a Japanese drummer at the time. They a lot of people at MI were like, dude, you're awesome, great job, thanks, we'll see you next week. Those guys are like, all right, you kind of can play. You almost sound like you're about to play something, man. So I want you to listen to these 20 guys. You know, those guys were not patting me on the back. Like, listen to this tape of these 20 songs and come back next week. You know, because I was jumping classes. I wasn't supposed to be in their class yet. I came in like week 1, saw some people playing on stage and went like, I can play shit out of that, you know, and so got in line.
So you thought you were...
So I thought I had
stuff.
a confidence, man. Not hot stuff, but I had a confidence. Like, I thought MI was going to be harder school than it was. So I was, you know what I mean? But I walked in and there's people there who, if you pay, you can be in the class. You're a dentist. You want to play bass for a year. Take a year off and go play bass. That's great. I'm glad there's a place like that. But also you could get as much out of that school as you wanted. And I found the teachers there that did not give me any high fives, that basically just like tore my ass down to the ground, made me listen to the masters and showed me about that question that you just asked me. And it's still something that I'm working on at this point in my life.
I think it's almost like an elusive, it's kind of like, you know how they say in India, sitar, it takes 2 lifetimes to master or something like that. In other words, like you're never going to achieve, you know, 2 lifetimes, you don't get that.
Yeah.
So it's that whole issue, I think, no matter what, you're always getting.
Look at us, man. We're not the youngest guys, but we're both hungry and we're working hard at what we do and we're studying. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And that to me is what's keeping me from being fucking 50 years old. You know what I mean?
Sure.
In the 50-year-old sense that most of the people that I went to school with are 50 years old.
Right.
Right? And when you're in contact with people that you grew up with, you see how different people kind of like, they have their peak or they go down or whatever. I feel like, you know, my life is still reaching, man. And it keeps me hungry and it keeps me on top.
Still striving.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, you said something interesting once. This was a long time ago. 12
To you or
years
to
ago.
somebody?
No, to someone that I read, an old interview, where you said, when you go to Toledo, most people still give you the same strange looks, and they don't care that you're the bass player in Weezer. And that sounded to me like that actually would be kind of a grounding thing.
Right.
Like a good thing almost. To have
It's
a space.
true, man. I made my peace with Toledo because I felt uncomfortable there my whole life. You know, and I'd leave and I'd come back and I'd still feel uncomfortable. I'd be like, God damn it, you know, like, where are my people? I found my people in Los Angeles, obviously.
Right.
At this point, I can go to Toledo and totally embrace it. And it is where I came from. I absolutely love that town. You know, and it is a great experience. It's not like I walk around where people are like, Scott from Weezer, you know. It's not that day, right?
Right.
But still, like, I go to Toledo and it's just like, what's up with that weird guy? What are you saying? Why are you talking to me like that? Like, it's a trip.
Yeah, and I mean, that's interesting that having achieved success, quote unquote, and you know, working man success doesn't necessarily undo the tension that one feels with their hometown and all those things that are just sort of soaked in there from when you were younger.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's what got me where I am today. Obviously, that thing that's in, you know, you moved.
right,
You're from where again?
the Bronx.
Okay,
And I
so-
feel the same thing
Right.
that you're talking about.
So there's this thing that it's the same instinct that made me want to play bass. That I feel like the universe, you know, like kind of planted in me, or I wound up with, however that works, at assignment of missions of souls, right? There's like all right, this kid, all right, got it. We put this stuff in it. Just let him grow. Don't fuck him up, and just don't fuck him up too much. He'll get a little help here and there. Just don't get in his way. So it was the same thing. It's like I knew that I was meant to be somewhere else. You know, I moved to LA in '89 I didn't get in Weezer till 2001.
Right.
So that was a lot longer time in LA. I thought that I was hot shit, best bass player in Toledo, Ohio kind of guy. And I'm going to be a superstar any minute. And I got my fucking ass ground down to the ground in Hollywood. Like, and it was great. You know, it was great. Like, why else would you go on tour with Vanilla Ice for a year?
I was going to ask you
So
about that.
it was like that. I was willing to do anything. I was downtown flower market, middle of the night, bunching flowers for fixed $50 cash in the morning.
Okay.
Working for Golden Voice, holding mic stands for Alanis Morissette, like whatever it took
Right,
to
and
pay the bills and still stay
Film,
in LA.
working in film, and what did experiences like auditioning for Ozzy and Lenny Kravitz and touring with Vanilla Ice for a year? What
Yeah.
did that teach you?
It just showed me how, you know, how to be humble, right? How to show up, and really, if nothing else, what can you bring? What are you going to bring to the table? Like, I learned so much at that Ozzy Osbourne audition, and you can't pay for that kind of feeling. That much adrenaline, to be that desperate, you know, to love Ozzy as much as I do, to be that desperate for a gig, to go and show up for something that could make or break your career. How are you gonna show up for that? Are you gonna fold? Are you gonna show your best? Or are you gonna come like a maniac? I showed up like a fucking maniac. You know what I mean? I procrastinated. I procrastinated learning the song. I waited too long, and then it was Robert was in a different tuning. Whoever recorded it, I don't remember who it was at that time. Sorry, excuse me. They were in a different kind of tuning, you know, because Robert was leaving to go do Metallica.
Right.
Right. They were looking for people. He was in a cool tuning, or it was in a five. It was like a 5-string, or however he recorded Perry Mason. You know what I mean? And the only way I could learn it was like this insane move. I was in the gym 2 hours a day. You know what I mean? I was chain smoking Marlboro Reds. I was drinking a pot of coffee an hour. I show up for this fucking audition, you know, like looking like Zakk Wylde, but who doesn't know the song.
Right.
So with that kind of intensity, and Joe, the guitar player at the time, came over in the middle of the audition, just like, he's like looking at my hands and looking at my face, like, "What are you doing, man? Why are you doing that?" You know, I was just all over the place trying to play this riff. So I learned a lot. You know, I obviously didn't get the audition, right? But I learned a lot. And then Lenny Kravitz, there were dudes that I saw in bass player magazines with resumes folded up in their arm,
Sitting in the
waiting line of 100
right.
fucking people. You know, like respected bass players that I was like, wow, I don't have a chance. If that guy's here, I don't have a chance at this gig.
I remember reading Stephen King's memoir around the time I started in 2010, and he said he doesn't think about theme at all as he's writing. It's all just unconscious, start and get to the end. And then he goes back and rereads it, and then he realizes, oh, I see, this is one of the main themes. And he may go back and make a few revisions to enhance that. But it's not like he set out to write a book about a certain theme. And that was the case with this album too. It was only when I was pretty much done that we realized there's three main themes here. And if you're hearing slightly different themes than I am, I can't say that you're wrong and I'm right. But I mean, I noticed there's definitely a handful of songs that are about the way our music is received by the audience. And there's a handful of songs about relationships with women. And then I saw this third category as being about father figures, and I mean that pretty loosely. There's Foolish Father, which, you know, it could be me singing about my father or me singing about being a father in relation to my daughter. There's Eulogy for a Rock Band, which is Weezer singing about its musical forefathers. There's The British Are Coming, which is our country
Right.
in relation to its imperial father, the British Empire. Of course, that's kind of an analogy for what was going on in my life, but they're just different ways of looking at father figures.
Yeah, when you listen to I've Had It Up to Here into The British Are Coming, I mean, it's clear that that's like a suite, you know, where the one song blends into the other, but it's kind of like, whoa, okay, it's I've Had It Up to Here, there are many things it's sort of a litany almost, listing things that you're sort of impatient with. And you mentioned relationship songs. I've always been curious how people who are married and appear to be settled or say that they're, their marriage is stable, write these sort of gritty relationship songs, angsty stuff? Where does that come from when you're already...
Well, I think those relationships with women that's the number one most classic song for a band to write about. It's so natural and effortless and it's timeless, and people are always going to relate to that. So, sometimes I even try to avoid that topic, but at the end of the day, you just have to go with the best songs, and so many of them seem to be about women still. And yeah, there's definitely like the song "Ain't Got Nobody." You could say, well, how can you possibly sing that with any sincerity? Because you've been married for years now, and you appear so happy, and
you got plenty of buddies.
Yeah,
your family, your bandmates. You feel that way towards your audience.
Yeah, all I can say is that for me, and probably for anyone, you're going to have a bad day, and on that day you might feel totally alone and like no one understands you and there's no one there for you, and that's when you happen to pick up the guitar and write the song, and it doesn't represent the totality of me and my life, but that's how I felt in that moment.
And that's also a universal chord, maybe second place to girl songs, or for girls, boy songs, or whatever it may be. And then "Nobody Gets Me" or "Nobody's in My Corner" kind of stuff. Like that's probably the second cat. Maybe "Cars" or somewhere in there, or more, skateboarding or something. One more question about lyrics before, because I definitely want to talk to you about working with Rick again, but. There's a Buddhist themed magazine named Shambhala Sun, and there was a piece from a good 8 years ago or so, and you were talking about Vipassana, which is also well documented. Your feelings on that and your experience with meditation and doing the 10-day retreats. But in that piece, you were quoted as saying that meditation allowed you to become a better person, a more compassionate person. And I'm curious about how that, number one, has affected your relationships within the band. It seems from that point on there's been more openness to input from band members, and I'm not sure how much of a correlation there is there. And also, in your music, there's a recurring sense of like yearning for a more innocent time that's directly referenced on the record, "Back to the Shack." I'm curious how being more compassionate and being more at peace might be reflecting in some of the things you're talking about, and that are not necessarily dealing with yourself, but excuse me, with the outside world a little bit more. That's a mouthful question, but
well, first of all, I got to give meditation a lot of credit. In the relationships within the band, I just feel like things are so much more harmonious now, and we really enjoy each other's company, and there's no place we'd rather be than on the road with each other, hanging out, or in the studio. It wasn't always like that. And yeah, just the tensions seem to have slowly melted away over the years. And boy, I'm grateful for that, because it would have been easy for some conflict to get out of control, and then next thing you know, you've broken up, and who knows what we'd be doing right now.
What were some of those tensions? I mean, there's obviously, you've talked before about, you described it as a totalitarian regime around the period of '99 when you started managing the band. But what are some of the tensions? Where does that arise from, other than you telling people what their role is and then sometimes not caring, oscillating between those two things? Like, what else has caused tension in the band? Hey, welcome to Feedback Def. I'm Sabby RK, the apostate music journalist. You know, when I ask myself the question, what is the most fun interview I've ever done? Hands down, the first one that comes to mind is Weezer in 2014. But not because of Rivers Cuomo. He certainly helped. It was because I got to interview bassist Scott Schreiner and bandleader Rivers Cuomo separately with a Weezer superfan who also happens to be one of my dearest friends. And I want to tell you all about it. Now, if you're not a paying subscriber to my Substack, you'll only hear excerpts from these two interviews. Paying subscribers get to hear the whole thing. And I got to tell you, I haven't heard these interviews in a long time, but I was pretty knocked out at how much substance there is there. And if you don't want to take my word for it, Scott Schreiner will tell you at the end of his what he thought of my questions. But especially listening back to the Rivers Cuomo interview, I was like, man, I had forgotten how wide-ranging and how much synergy there was in that conversation. Rivers Cuomo is an artist I have had very mixed feelings about. I've been very ambivalent since pretty much day one, since the first time I ever encountered Weezer, which I was living in a house with some other really good friends of mine in 1995, saw Sweater Song on MTV, and I was like, blah, 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 these dorks, these geeks, blah, blah, what the fuck, blah, blah. Of course, I got called a nerd growing up, so I was not able to accept that all of a sudden the world had opened its arms to nerds playing, rockin' music. I have since come around, largely because of my friend Weezer Steve and his one-time bandmates, brothers Rick and Scott Cochler. All three of these dudes, Weezer Steve, Scott and Rick, were in a band named FMGREEN, who I happened to be able to record. I just started working at this recording studio named GFI here in Rochester where I live, and mostly local bands for the most part, mostly youngish, either early 20s, either just out of high school or early college, or maybe there were a couple still in high school, but it's mostly young adult local bands. And I hadn't been there for very long. This would have been 2001. I think it was New Year's Day. I get thrown into a session with this band, FMGREEN. These guys have been friends of mine ever since. I have borrowed money from these people. I am still using Rick Cochler's guitar. It's on extended loan for the last, 18 years or something. I mean, these people mean a lot to me. And so we did a 4-song EP or something. And then a year later, we did their first full-length album, which, although there are certain things I would approach differently about it, remains one of the artistic achievements of my life. There's a lot that I would want to do differently with it. I would certainly want to master it differently. I like the mix a lot. I like what we did. I could have used some help mixing the vocals. But enough about FMGREEN, other than to tell you, these guys were big Weezer fans, and there is an FMGREEN sticker on the guitar that Rivers Cuomo is holding on the cover of the Green album. Now, I'm not usually that impressed by stuff like that, but I know how much that meant to those guys, and as a result, it means a lot to me. It's just, man, at the time, for them to have their sticker, I don't even know what to compare it to. For them, it must have been like the Beatles or something, like John Lennon, fucking shouting them out. And it's just a really cool, innocent, lovely story. Because they were so wide-eyed and full of just a sense of promise around music that I think is really, really, really special, and I always associate it with that time. So, Steve didn't get the nickname Weezer Steve for nothing. when I met this dude the second time around, Weezer were working on the album Maladroit. And at that point, they were Rivers Cuomo in particular, was very engaged with fans online. This is prior to this being like the standard thing. And he was sharing works in progress, like songs that were not finished, and actually soliciting input from his online following of fans, of like super dork kids who were, very much the type of people who would have been dialed into this kind of thing. And I remember thinking that was like the lamest thing to like focus group your creative decisions in front of your audience and let them have a say. However, Steve got to have, like, he gave feedback on a solo and Rivers embraced it. And so Steve was so meticulous about his fandom that he had all of these like message board communications with everybody's, not just his, printed out and put in like binders with like laminated sheets and like, the plastic on the fucking binder. And he's got binders of that whole period, which is awesome, because I don't know how much of that stuff, if any, is archived at this point. You need people like Steve to do this kind of thing. And at the time, I was not a Weezer fan. In fact, I said to the guys in FMGREEN, I like your music more. I respond to it more. It's not because I know you. I feel something more for what you guys are bringing. It's not, again, because I wasn't friends with them when I first met them. But I started to come around at that point, and I have since, over the years, come around, and now I've come around. I'm certainly not a super fan or even a really, really, really ardent fan. There's stuff that they do that I really, really, really don't like, that I think is like pop dreck. And then there's stuff that they do that I really, really, really like. Mostly their more experimental, out there stuff. In fact, my favorite album by them is like their most wacky one. Maladroit happens to be one of their more adventurous albums, and so I started to go, this seems pretty cool. And at a certain point, I think it was 2008, they released that single Troublemaker. I was like, this guy writes hooks like you wouldn't. I mean, it is undeniable his knack for hooks. They're just so infectious. And I went back and I started getting into the first album, and I would say I really like them now. And I like them even more after this experience, which I had mostly forgotten about the nuts and bolts of the conversations. But recently, I came across YouTuber Mark But Evil's YouTube video, Island in the Sun and Weezer's Reinvention. And watching that, for me, was like watching a horror movie. Like the little scream emoji. Because Mark But Evil gets into this well-documented period in Rivers Cuomo's life. I believe it was between Pinkerton and the Green Album, where, for those that don't know, Weezer's first album sold 5 million in the States, and then Pinkerton, their second album, was considered a failure at first. It sold a tenth of what the first album sold, so it went gold, and Cuomo took the rejection really, really, really hard, went to Harvard. The future of the band was uncertain, and then in the 5-year gap that it took them to make their third album, Pinkerton became a cult hit slowly over time. And so by the time the Green Album came out, there was a hit single on there, and then I think Pinkerton was certified gold at the time, or so. I don't remember exactly. The fans will know this, and you can look all that up. But it was a sleeper hit and acquired a legend as they were about to unveil this new album. But in between there, let's just say Cuomo went through a period of profound creative self-doubt, marked by this time where he like put himself in like a black room with no windows and painted the walls black and tried to get to
like this sort of ultimate formula for what makes, I don't know if it was a hit song or a catchy song, and approached it in this really, really like laser microscopic focused scientific way. And it's like, dude, you don't need to do that. You of all people have this innate ability. You don't need to fucking think about this so much. It's really, ugh. But I mean, you're talking about somebody who was socially awkward and all of a sudden was immersed in this like massive success, and then that gets taken away. So that's going to discombobulate a person. Needless to say, the band gets through this, and then they are on their merry way, and they've pretty much, not exactly, but they've alternated between putting out really, really poppy records and really experimental records ever since then. The album that I interviewed Scott and Rivers about, that was out in 2014, is called Everything Will Be All Right in the End. And that's one of their more like broad-ranging records, and I really, really like it. And it also has a super catchy, I mean, this song is just, man, this is like the epitome of that kind of song. It's called Back to the Shack. That's one of my favorite songs by them. So I was talking to them during that period. At the time, I was writing for a now out-of-print magazine named Alarm. My editor there at the time, Scott Morrow, shout out Scott, who now has a music project named Plutocracy Planet, which we'll get into another time, but shout out Plutocracy Planet. You should check them out. I'll link in the description below. Scott calls me up one day and he's like, hey, do you want to do a feature story on Weezer? We want to run something. We want to run a feature, maybe even I don't remember if it was a cover story or not. And he's like, their publicist is giving us a choice between either you get like 40 minutes on the phone, or you can do it in person, but you get less time, and you would have to go to Buffalo. They were playing this like corporate radio festival, one of those concerts that like a radio station puts on, and there's a bunch of bands. You'd have to go to Buffalo to do it. And I almost always do my interviews over the phone, or at the time it would have been Skype. Now it's Zoom. Having to do an interview in person, there's just so much more to think about. And if you're prone to anxiety like me, I've always managed to plow through my anxiety in interviews, but I hate when it like crops up. And if you're in person, there's all the more chance that could rear its head. And all sorts of stuff. I mean, you have to worry about eye contact a lot, and where you sit. You have to shower. So my immediate reaction is, of course, I'd rather do this like sitting at home, but I gotta ask Steve. I can't pass this up if I can take Steve with me. So I call him up. I'm like, dude, you are the only reason why I would go do this interview in person. I'm not interested otherwise. So are you in? Do you want to go to the show and pretend to be assisting me while I interview these guys? And he's like, yeah, of course. I'm like, okay, cool, bet, let's go. So we drive to Buffalo. I remember it being a very pleasant summer day. It was in August of 2014, so pleasant. We eat. We're first scheduled to talk to Scott Schreiner in the lobby of the hotel, which you'll hear the background noise. It's not really, really bad, but you'll hear that where the band is staying. And immediately when Steve brandishes three digital handheld recorders, it's obvious to anybody who's ever even gotten close to recording anything that it's total overkill and it's a sham, basically. I mean, at the most, you need two. One going and one backup. Steve has got headphones. I think one of them has a tripod, and he's plugging it in, and he's like very like attentively checking levels, which, is obviously ridiculous. And Scott Schreiner even says, oh, wow, you got 3 tape recorders. So that interview, as you'll hear, does not get off on the best foot. However, it doesn't take long before we are off and running, and I will let you determine, just from what Scott said, Let's just say Steve and I walked away from that, and at this point we're flying high. We're like, yeah, wow, okay, boom. And I rarely do interviews back to back because that feeling, that adrenaline rush when an interview goes well is so powerful. It's very hard for me to concentrate. I have to do something completely unrelated. Usually go for a bike ride or a walk or something. But I say, okay, Steve, I can pretty much guarantee you this is like the first half of the Super Bowl. We just had a really great, awesome first half. We're going to completely have to change our strategy. I bet. Watch. I just know the approach is going to be, it's going to be like a completely different animal talking to Rivers Cuomo. Turns out to be the case. I had completely forgotten again just how much this guy won me over just talking. And this is proof positive. I would encourage you to keep this in mind. When you think you don't like someone based on what you're seeing on your TV or your screen, I'm convinced at this point, just about anybody I would talk to in person in an interview setting, I would end up walking away with at least some admiration, if not complete admiration for them. And I'm really, really, really impressed by what he was saying and just his presence. And I was also surprised at how comfortable I felt, how like not awkward this was, because Steve, so we go into this, we are shepherded by his personal assistant, handler, whatever, the lady who we're supposed to report to, who walks us into this like trailer, this like nondescript, there's like bottles of water and chips, and you really get to see like how not glamorous this whole thing is, and how even with a book, or even with cell phones or laptops, earbuds, to sit around and wait in these places for hours before you have to play looks like it would be fucking torture. It really is not glamorous. But we're in there, and Steve sets up. And it's hitting me. I'm like, yo, I'm like interviewing my friend, my really close friend, like this person who he has so much, like such intensity of feeling for as an artist, and this person's music means so much to him. Where for me, this is a little more impersonal. It's a lot more impersonal because I'm not as invested in Weezer, right? I'm just kind of on an adventure. And of course, I want it to go well. I don't want this to fuck up. And I definitely don't want an awkward interview. And plus, it was so good the first time with Scott. I want that adrenaline rush again. I want fucking victory here, right? So I want to hit a home run. So gets off to a really, really, really easy start and stays that way. And occasionally Steve will lean forward, pretend to be twiddling a knob, and just touch it. And I see that out of the corner of my eye. It's all I can do to not just fucking burst out laughing in the middle of this interview. Because I know, and the other thing that's funny is I know Rivers can see. I'm like 2 feet away from Rivers. We're sitting on a couch, and I'm like facing him like this. Steve is over there, like, I don't know, maybe 5 feet away. And Rivers can fucking see, like, this is total bullshit. Like I know these guys are fucking putting me on. Like, there's no need for this other person to be here. All he had to do was put the fucking thing on the table and just hit record, and we're good. So, at the beginning, you'll hear, hey, can we have like a 5-minute warning, I ask, because I don't want the person, because, it seems like one of those situations that's, these handler type people, they like to stick to their program. So I am concerned that we're going to be in the middle of a great question, and they're going to be like, you gotta go. That's it, stop, ding, 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 ding. So I'm like, hey, can we maybe have like a 5-minute warning? So Rivers is like, oh, do you want me to set my timer on my phone? I'm like, yeah. So the 5-minute warning goes off. And at this point, this experience has been a huge win already. Like, we're on the home stretch. This interview is going super well. I'm really, really into the conversation. I'm really like admiring this person in a way that I never have before. Which again, I would recommend. Anybody you think you don't like, try to talk to them in person if you can. Especially for journalist types or anybody in media. Sit down with them and see if you don't walk out of there with a completely different view of who they are. And so the second buzzer goes off. And I'm right in the middle of a question asking him about the band's drummer, Pat Wilson, who's like my favorite part of that band, actually. And Rivers says, I think that's our time. And that's it. Now, Steve thought, oh, that was really strange. Steve thought that was kind of dismissive and curt. I didn't take it that way at all. I felt like Rivers was like, well, you guys I feel like if I hadn't said anything at all about the time limit, he would have not been concerned about it. But since I set those parameters, this is just my hunch gauging from Rivers' makeup, from what I can glean from things I've seen and my own interaction with him. I have a hunch that if I hadn't said that, he would have just answered the question and just talked until somebody came and told him he had to be finished. Right? I don't think he was like, I don't want to answer that question. Screw you guys. I'm out of here. That's enough. It comes off as a little awkward, but I think it was his form of trying to be helpful. I could be wrong about that. Or his form of sticking to the prescribed plan as I had requested it, and he interpreted it. Now, this all ends up being worth it anyway, because just at that moment, the assistant comes into the trailer and says, and you don't hear this on the recording, I think Pat's on a boat. And we all, one by one, the assistant, Rivers, Steve, and me, we all spill out of this trailer and see Pat on the back of a boat smoking a cigar as we all turn our heads. Because like right there's this like waterway that goes into Lake Erie, this like bay. And we're all just like, and that was it. And then we go to the show, and I enjoyed the show too. I had seen them once before and thought they were very, very lifeless. I don't remember when it was. It was in an arena show. Must have been 2002, something like that. And I just thought it was incredibly like, oh my God, they seemed like zombies up there. This time was different. Of course, if you go to a show with a super fan, they've seen the band do everything. So Steve is just like, I'm not impressed. Like he didn't say that, but nothing they were doing could surprise him at this point. You know what I mean? And but I really enjoyed the show. It was a wonderful experience, and I just always really value when I get to talk to somebody that somebody I know and care about really, really loves, and whose music means a lot to that person. That always means a lot to me. Obviously, when I talk to people who I love, it means a lot to me too. But there's a nice special, there's an extra special quality to it when you can share this with someone else. And yeah, that's the story. That's the most fun interview I've ever done. And now Steve and I will say, I think that's our time, as an inside joke that's become part of our, our parlance. Also, if you go to my Substack, you'll see there's a show on YouTube, a complete show. And I was like, man, these guys were the real shit when they were like still. It's like, man, if I had happened to see them at that time, I'd have been instantly sold by the energy and the hunger and the enthusiasm and the striving at that show, which I talk about in my Substack essay. So, without further ado,
I guess that's our time. 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 Our time.